now we are going to the questions session. If you allow me, I would like to start with a question for both of our lecturers. In your presentations, it is clear that we need new ways to display and to describe these objects to deal with this pressure for decolonization and more information about collections. In these projects, research projects you mentioned, we already have this new cataloging or metadata standards to represent in a more proper way these objects. Do we need a specific one, for example, for indigenous art from the Arctic, or for African art for specific regions, or we are talking about a new but general way of describing collections to give more context regarding all these issues with a new context and decolonization?
Sorry, Gabriel, who did you direct the question to?
For you too,
okay.
Sylvester. You can start answer if you like.
No, Norman, if you don't mind starting.
I'll give it a try. I think, as I understand your question, you're asking if the documentation standards should be modified, and how are they modified or rethought when different communities come into the museum. Is that along the lines of your question?
Yeah, that's it, Norman.
Okay.
If we need new standards, or if you need just to modify the way museums use the standards, or if you, as I noticed in your presentation, you were proposing different things, and we already have a different proposal of displaying this project, right?
Well, I think I'll answer that this way. I think a lot of museums right now are scrambling to do different things and to do what they think is the right thing. And there is a lot of good work that's been done on rethinking the kinds of standards and language, and a lot of practices that have been shaped around how to work collaboratively and consultatively with Indigenous communities to have concepts that are meaningful to Indigenous communities, that facilitate their engagement with these collections. One of the challenges of the Reciprocal Research Network is that it moved beyond Northwest Coast collections. And so when you have, the minute you move beyond and start talking about universal collections, universal collections, you still have one database, you still have one search interface. And so you're already kind of stepping away from the kind of cultural specificity that these kinds of projects demand. So I'm not sure if that is at all helpful. I mean, I'm developing one right now with some communities that I'm working with in the Arctic, and we haven't gotten that far in terms of thinking of what would be the meaningful cultural categories that you would use to describe collections, and that's kind of where we're going next with this. So I hope, I don't know if that was at all helpful. So thank you.
It was. Thank you very much, Norman.
Thank you.
With regard to the collection and displays of African art, I don't directly work in museums. I work with museums, and that's a slightly different position to be in. What I do know is that there is a really problematic way in which knowledge builds on knowledge to create structures that become increasingly difficult to tackle or engage with. And the question of digital documentation is certainly part of that, right? So you've got algorithms being trained on existing data, which, as I'm putting out here, represents wrong, knowledge about certain artifacts, right? But museums are uploading all this information that's already existing to online systems, where algorithms are being trained through these images to present certain ideas of cultural practice. So that's one issue. How you can apply this very directly to indigenous communities is a slightly different thing. The kind of communities I have in mind, I work with in regard to Africa, are not, I don't know whether we can describe them as indigenous in the sense of communities that are kind of operating in fairly separate spheres of culture. Most of these societies have never been any such thing. And what Norman mentioned about the movement of objects from one location to another that sort of complicates provenance research is an example of that. So for these indigenous communities, we're dealing in the contemporary era with many interlocutors who are literate, who have formal education, and who are trying to balance, the requirements of indigenous protocols of organization with the existing systems that derive, from the historical context of global colonialism over the past 500 years. So we cannot build a separate database for every single culture. That just does not work. We cannot develop individual protocols of identification and evaluation for each individual cultural artifact. Again, that's wrong. What we can do is to intensify the fullness of information about any of these singular artifacts, and through that, what knowledge always does is to make generalizations based on certain amounts of data. My argument proceeds on the assumption that we are making generalizations with wrong data, and filling out that data properly is already a step in the right direction. The other issues that are going to be tackled in relation to that, how the museum organizes itself from inside, the kind of transformations needed, to reduce cultural and structural inequities. All those are, each one spirals out into a gigantic area of both work and problems. But I'm not in favor of thinking that we can find very personal individual solutions for all these issues. Considering the mass of artifacts we're dealing with. There are societies in Africa that have been completely wiped out during the colonial period, and their artifacts are being claimed by nation states, that are themselves fairly unstable. And you've got all these things. Sort of the Igbo people, for example, have actually Nigerians in a very large way have fallen prey to Pentecostal and fundamentalist Christianity, and are engaging in the destruction of indigenous artifacts of this kind. So both out here in the West, where we're engaging the location of these objects, and in Africa itself, massive amounts of re-education is actually needed, to redefine people's relationships to these objects. And that's where I'm intervening, on the actual structural practices of museums themselves. I really don't have much to say to that.
Thank you very much, Sylvester. We have a question from the audience for Professor Sylvester from Luciana Gonçalves. Professor, how do you think intellectual property could be recognized in favor of diversity? Because what I realize with my studies, I don't know if I'm wrong, is that requirements of intellectual property are also Westernly established. Could we think on an organizer of the work if we think in recognizing IP to be entitled in favor of a tribe or folk, for instance? Thank you.
Luciana, that's a very good question. The idea of requirement of intellectual property being Westernly is you're thinking about the way that it's been structured. It's been structured to support the capitalist acquisition of objects, and in Western culture, ownership is kind of thought of in individual terms. Remember what I said about Wheelock acquiring that artwork that I mentioned earlier? That is how intellectual property is often seen. But you can recognize cultural ownership of intellectual property in the sense that within the cultures that we're dealing with here, these were artworks that came out of collective cultural evolution over several decades or centuries in some instances. So yeah, I definitely think you can do that. But I also think that even with the Westernly protocols that are in place, sometimes the problem is not that they are Westernly, but the problem is that they don't actually operate in the ways that they should. All the time I worked on the Benin cultural patrimony issue Macron made his before Macron made his speech that sort of turned everybody on into that. The question I kept on encountering was how would you prove your ability to stand as somebody who could, say, contest the intellectual property rights of these materials in court. And you know, it's always a very complicated thing, because that requires you go through the Western legalistic protocols of producing documents that ties you directly to that process. Well, my grandfather was in Benin in 1897 when the British bombarded the palace and destroyed the city. He lost his wife and two children. You know, and this is something that has very direct impact on people that you can actually trace right up till the present time. So my existence as somebody whose great grandmother is from Benin is not recognized by Western protocols, and that's what I meant when I mentioned that idea of the owner of the Winyama mask, selling the mask, in which the mask is supposed to represent his soul. We don't have any language for dealing with these kind of things in our analysis of intellectual property rights and culture. And Norman, for example, I actually do teach Kwakiutil and Northwest Coast art as part of a broad course that I teach, and you'd find that the same problems apply. The protocols of intellectual property rights and representation that allows somebody to own a Vermeer painting and identifies Vermeer as the producer of that painting, is being applied willy-nilly to non-Western societies in which different conceptions of ownership and production are in place. So those are some of the work we need to do to start this process. As for displacing those Western modes that we're talking about, it's gonna take much more work to do that, because basically these modes undergird a very broad, structure of systemic and social operations. So how are you going to get them out of the way? It's just not going to be that easy. But nevertheless, challenging the ideas, challenging the prescriptions they provide is a good way to begin. And yes, we should recognize IP in favor of a tribe. We should recognize, IP in favor of a community, depending on how it looks. In my own indigenous culture, we recognize the personhood of trees. So these are the kind of things that native peoples have thought of everywhere, and that we need to bring into the modern world if this world is going to survive another 500 years. If we're going to survive the next 100 years, we need to bring these ideas in, that things have their own independent existence, and you cannot own the world, in essence, which is what the Western culture has tried to do for the past 500 years.
Thank you very much, Sylvester. Norman, do you want to do any comments regarding this?
Yeah, maybe just very briefly. The one thing, the questions of ownership and intellectual property do get enormously complicated around these situations, and what you don't see in the reciprocal research network that I showed were the repatriations that you do see some, but the basic provenance research is required to move the discourse into another field of action, which can be repatriation. But one of the interesting things is that one of the Indigenous cultural centers that is a participant of the RRN, they have a substantive collection now, because their collection was actually repatriated from the National Museum in the late 1970s. And so they're partnering and sharing in this network the collection that they acquired through a repatriation. So, and certainly the community has, as I mentioned, very complex ideas of ownership and how rights to display objects are held, within the community. And in some ways, what they're doing doesn't kind of fit the Western model of ownership. But to that, I might say that the inventive part of this for Indigenous communities would be the kinds of alliances and they can be very uneasy alliances that they make with different systems of ownership and power, because they identify a benefit here. And one of the benefits for, say, the Mystic Cultural Center is that they get their young people to work and to train in different fields of activity relating to their cultural collections, and they can have access to different collections around the world. So there are these kind of uneasy alliances where people's own systems of property, which are much different from Western ones, kind of coexist within that, out of necessity. They coexist within that Western system of property and IP and ownership. And as I said, it's sort of an uneasy fit, but it does happen.
Thank you, Norman. We have a question, a related question from our colleague Alexandre Matos. The community participation in this documentation and provenance research is more and more important, but the methodology shouldn't change. Should we question the way we build knowledge and we do research? For both of you, sorry. So, Sylvester, if you want to start.
I do think we should question the way we do knowledge, do research and produce knowledge. That's the whole focus of the paper that I just presented. So yeah, the modes of producing knowledge should change. The question of what they're going to change into is a very fundamental question. Right now, we have knowledge production that's structured on a certain idea of objects, and that idea of objects, that process is reinforced over and over and over again in different kinds of items that are produced, to discuss those objects. So take that Winyama mask that I mentioned, for example. The mask has been reproduced in different catalogs, and even till now, you still have exhibition catalogs, that come out and still present African artworks in that kind of decontextualized, neutral background kind of thing. For many of the people working on these exhibitions, and these are my colleagues, and I don't doubt the sincerity of ethics or intention, but for many of them, the historical implications of this mode of representation is not even something they consider. They seem to be engaged in, sustaining and reaffirming the museums, the museum's collection in a way that just basically says the museum owns these works and it thinks these works are great and its interpretation is valid, and here are a few more images of the works doing one thing or the other. Through this process, we're sometimes creating interpretations for these works that completely run against what indigenous interpretations of the works are. There are a lot of works we have in different museums on African art that show artworks that were never meant to be seen. These artworks were never meant to be in public display, but here they are in the museums, and we still keep having statements talking about them without an effort to understand what that fact of not being seen actually means to the structure and identity of the objects. So there's a lot of stuff that's on the ground we have a lot of resources and a lot of protocols that we can still use. Most of these are not being used fully. Sometimes the issue is not just to go and create new ways of doing things willy-nilly. Is to kind of look at what you're doing and see how you can, within that existing structure, expand or reconfigure its focus. The kind of questions you ask will always determine the kind of answers you get. So, are we even asking the right questions? Is something that one would have to think about in relation to these issues.
Thank you, Sylvester. Norman, would like to answer?
I think I'll add two things to this, if I may. Well, one of the insights that I think we have to bring to ideas of provenance research is that the provenance doesn't begin when the collector acquires a piece, that the pieces have a very rich social biography, and the interaction between that initial collector and that object, there's a whole prehistory to that thing, to that object, to that it has a life, it had an existence before a collector came in. Because oftentimes on museum records, the collector is the first point of the provenance, and that's where the documentary record begins. And we have to have a more sophisticated understanding of that context and build it into the records, because we know now, from our contextual research, in some cases, the person who made the sale might not have had opens up to the question of intellectual property. The person that made the sale might not have had the right to sell that piece, that they may have been the custodian for their culture of that piece, and they sold it to a collector, most likely under duress, so we have to rebuild those prehistories, if you will. It doesn't even make sense to call it a prehistory, because these are the histories of the objects, but the notion that a collector is the first point of the provenance is something we have to really move away from. The other thing, and this is just kind of my little plug, I would say, I'm always amazed by how important basic art historical skills and research methodologies are, just to have people looking and comparing, because you'd be surprised that we have a lot of students that talk about collections, but they don't, it's like they're not even looking at them. So, and I think, and this is, I guess, again, not against your question, but it's sort of adding a dimension to your question that says we can't throw away all of our methodologies, because we have a lot of good methodologies now. We just have to be smart about how we use them.
Well, thank you very much, Norman. I don't think we have any other questions for the public, but I would like to ask you another one, if you allow me. We know that most of these collections are kind of hidden in museums' backlogs. Usually we can see where's there a polemic, so we can see a small part of these collections are brought to public. And this means documentation has a very important tool. Museums need to publish their data more and do more research on these collections that are hidden, especially in institutions like you both said, institutions that also collect Western art, because in these institutions, these collections are usually not a priority. So we need to change these institutions, and these professionals need to change the focus of their work. And I would like to ask you if you have any kind of, you were both involved in this kind of research projects. Is there a better or a starting point that museums should take to start this process of changing on how they, what collections they are choosing to work, and how they are working these collections to put forward the data? Do you have any strategies that you could share with us for museums that are struggling with this, how to start this process of reviewing the way they document and present their collections?
Norman, you should start this one, because you actually work in a museum. So.
Okay, it's such a big question. How do museums start? I think, I think it has to start with an institution acknowledging their own history. And, I spent almost 10 years working at a national museum, and I was actually astounded by how little institutions of memory think about their own history, and how little they refract their own history into the kinds of work that they produce for the public. So I would say, if you're an institution, think about your own history, how collections came into your being or possession, if you will, and try to work backwards from there. There are knowledgeable people who want to share their expertise. You just have to pay them, and connecting with communities to provide insight and expertise is a good starting point, but not it's not infallible either, for I think reasons that come up. So I'm not sure if this is at all helpful, but I think the first thing is for institutions to think about their own histories and investigate your own history as an institution first.
So that's a that's a good point, and I agree that it's definitely a place to begin from. Um, I don't, there are so many issues involved in this. I don't think we can be searching for any kind of certainty in how to proceed. Everyone is experimenting in different ways and should experiment in different ways to come up with things that actually suit their own situations and their collections in this specificity. But one of the ways that for museums that hold collections of indigenous peoples, one of the main things that needs to be done is to start speaking to to representatives or members of those indigenous communities, and I will stress representatives because in the past, in the field of African art history and anthropology and ethnography, there was a lot of researchers going into certain kind of areas and finding interlocutors who are not necessarily experts in what they are talking about. And that's this assumption that the knowledge is generally available to everybody and a member of the culture should know the knowledge. That's a very terrible assumption. Nobody would walk into the street and just stop anybody and start discussing, rocket science with the expectation that rocket science is something that everybody should be aware of here. So understanding the specificity of expertise in this indigenous knowledge is a very fundamental element of changing mindsets about how these objects were created, what they were made for, and co. The most canonical speakers in this regard have always been, priests and village elders and whatever. But in Benin, for example, the first, indigenous history of Benin was written by a Benin person who wanted to correct some of the assumptions that had sort of became prominent in Western academic scholarship. So for cultures like the Yoruba culture, you've had a lot of people who've been doing different kinds of work in this regard.
There's another question from our colleague Alexandre Matos, also related to this subject. Do you agree to have mandatory programs for revisiting museum collections or museum collections documentations imposed by the central governments to museums, or this kind of programs should came from the community? How museum should change to accept this change in their position as owners of knowledge and producers of knowledge, to mediators between community and public? Norman would like to start?
Yeah, I get very uncomfortable when we talk about governments kind of managing how and what museums do. I think there is an important degree of autonomy that museums should have against state governments. However, there is a professional community and professional standards that museums must conform to and must. I think it is a question of engaging museums with those professional communities of standards to ensure that there is a kind of an acceptable level of engagement with communities. I don't know if that gets to your question about the sort of central government museums kind of having to adhere to a kind of a government standard around that. How should museums change to accept these changes in their positions as owners of knowledge and producers of knowledge to mediators between community and public? That's a really good question. That's a really good question. And, I worked at a national museum where we would have to participate in land claims, and the input that an anthropologist would have when they're sitting at the land claim table is oftentimes in support of the land claims that the indigenous community is putting forward. So the notion that a museum must abandon its role as a kind of a producer of knowledge, we have to be careful about that to some degree, but we also have to acknowledge that the museum does not have the sole authority over production of knowledge around its collection, and that engaging different communities around the production of knowledge relating to their collections is a critical part of how museums, of the social purpose of museums today, and the raison d'etre of museums. Museums take up a lot of public money, particularly in North America, and to some degree, a museum curator today must cede some of their assumed responsibility and authority around collections to other voices. So I think having a polyphony of voices is one way to do it. Although admittedly, it is a challenge when you're a museum curator. You don't really give up authority all the time. You control authority by controlling the people that you speak with and controlling the discourse. So I think that prospect of museums even giving up authority is a really challenging one.
Yeah, that's a really difficult thing in essence. But the idea that museums are owners of knowledge is part of what I primarily contest. Museums are not owners of knowledge; they are custodians of knowledge. That's what the original idea was. Being custodians of knowledge is being aware that this knowledge is produced in different places and it's embedded in different artifacts and cultural practices. And the museum's job, is not to claim ownership of those of that knowledge. And so that's why I was showing that mask and its representation in my talk. Basically, by defining itself as the arbiter of interpretation and meaning for that object, the museum has usurped the role of the actual cultural producers of the object. And that is where the primary problem lies. The museum has to begin by acknowledging, that the role of being the owner of knowledge is not defensible. But again, these are institutions, and their own institution protocols over time generates, knowledge that can legitimately be called their own knowledge. The knowledge of how the museum operates, the knowledge of the museum structure, the knowledge of its exhibition protocols and co. We're not contesting those as belonging to the museum. But the knowledge embedded in and about the cultural artifacts that they examine, is definitely not the museum's knowledge. And acknowledging that and starting from that point would be a very useful way to start to deconstruct, the museum's authority and its ability to be the final arbiter of meaning.
May I raise a question around
Sure.
that,
Please, Norbert.
if possible? But I see there is another question in the discussion, but I think we have to be very skeptical of claims where museums themselves talk about giving up authority, because in the example I think that Professor Ogbechi described around a rise of Pentecostalism in Nigeria, that is also a similar thing with indigenous communities in Canada as well. And there have been instances where a museum will reach out to work collaboratively with communities, but they will willfully not work with the Pentecostal part of the community. They'll work with the so-called traditionalists because they don't want to repatriate things that are going to be destroyed by Pentecostals. They want to repatriate to the knowledge keepers of the traditional knowledge. So these are decisions that the museum is making that reflects their power and their capacity to control and shape narratives. Is there are a lot of sides to that discussion, I think.
When I began my work on cultural patrimony, the original documents I drafted as a plan of action saw actual return of objects as a very distant end point, not where to start from. Mm-hmm. So that the museums are embroiled in the kind of situation they're in now is because they think of themselves as being located very specifically. They think of themselves as owning and controlling the materials within their collections and owning and controlling the knowledge that comes out of it. What I had intended, the plan I had created, was to start with a challenge over the intellectual property rights of these objects and settle that as a very formal issue. So the transfer of intellectual property rights of, say, Benin bronzes to, say, the kings of Benin or the Benin people would make the use and display of these bronzes dependent, to a large extent on securing permission from the indigenous communities. Having to do that will put the museums in greater dialogue with these communities in how they manage objects. And from that point on, if a museum chooses not to engage in that kind of situation, then they repatriate the object they have and say, we're done with it and we don't want to be involved in this anymore. But the host communities can also choose to have the museum keep the object, while that interaction goes on, and the management of ancillaries and knowledge coming out of that object becomes something that ties the museum to the communities. That was my what my greatest dismay was when I heard Macron's speech. Obviously, I'm not the president of France, so people paid much less attention to me. But I thought, oh my God, this is the worst way possible to think about this repatriation and restitution issue, because what everybody seems to be talking about now is just hand the objects over and disregard the past century and a half history of having had these subjects, the history that brought them out of where they were being returned in the first place, and all the ways in which these subjects have generated wealth and ancillary properties for the communities that held them. And we're using decolonial thinking to distance these communities from their responsibilities for this history, and just saying, hand the objects back to the owners, give the Benin bronzes back to the Benin people, and let the kings of Benin start worrying and struggling about how to preserve the bronzes and other kinds of things. So that is the reason why in recent times I've become kind of a bit disillusioned, because the sophistication I expected to emerge with the discourse of this restitution has given way to a very banal banal insight, and process where we're just talking about returning objects. The Savoy-Sarr report emphasized this other aspect of things considerably, but they also fell into the trap of, thinking that the returning of the objects would mark an immediate point of change and interaction. So I spent some time in Germany. The Benin bronzes at the Dahlem Museum that have now shifted to the Humboldt, right? The Humboldt can show these artworks, and if it follows the German government in returning them to Nigeria, it sees that as the end of its responsibility.
Yeah.
That building is built right in the very spot where Bismarck convened, the Berlin Conference that began all these problems for Africa in the first place. So its lack of historical awareness is kind of really astonishing. And without this paradigm that I've expressed here, which is what I thought would be the way to move this discussion forward, you're going to have such museums being able to think of operating independent of the cultures of origins of these artworks. They don't have to speak to anybody. They just have to make unilateral decisions like Germany makes to return the bronzes and say that's it, we're done. So there are big problems here. There are very, very big problems here.
Yeah, may I respond to that, if I may?
Sure, Norman,
in that, this is such an important thing, where museums look to repatriation as a kind of a resolution of all of their problems. And there's such a long history here. In the 1970s, what was the National Museum of Man in Canada, now it's known as the Canadian Museum of History, and that's the institution I used to work at. In the 1970s, they did a major repatriation of cultural property to different communities, well, mostly one community actually in the Northwest Coast, up to Alert Bay. Actually, there were two communities, and the material that was repatriated was material that was it has a very clear and established record where the federal government went onto the indigenous lands in the 1920s and confiscated potlatch materials, and it took all the stuff back to Ottawa. And the community started right away, actually, even before the Second World War, to press the government for those goods back. And by the time of the 1970s came, the director of the museum, George MacDonald, who himself was a trained archaeologist of the Northwest Coast, he made the decision to repatriate And that was very difficult for the museum. As you can imagine, in the 70s, he received a lot of criticism from other museums for doing that, because they felt, you've opened the door now. This is going to be, we're going to lose all of our inventory. But they did it. But when they did it back then, they had a condition. We will repatriate this to your community, but you have to build a museum. You have to have a climate controlled and all these kinds of things. And the community did it. And that's why there is the Umista Cultural Center in Alert Bay. But subsequent to that, other communities have said that's not your right to tell us, to dictate us how we're going to take things back. So the dilemma now, I don't know if I'd call it a dilemma, but how the thinking has shifted now is that the museum cannot provide conditions around repatriation. And in a way, I mean, there's a paradox here, because in a way that is very much in keeping with Western ideas of property. Like, once you alienate your rights to something, you can't claim. And the other ideas, from the 1970s had obligations around the ceremonial objects that they might be problematic from a Western legal perspective, but they were obligations that the community agreed to, perhaps because that was the only recourse that they had. But it is an interesting paradox that we have now.
Yeah, what that reflects is what I call decolonization of time. I wrote a few articles back in the day on how our conception of these objects as objects is actually quite problematic. There were, this kind of performance items that you're mentioning, I'm familiar with some of them. Many of them were made to be used and then discarded. There was a ritual process for the deconstruction of the object after use. What I call the life's end of the object. There was a way to manage that, which is not included in our thinking about objects in museum. So that idea that indigenous cultures must build, Western style museums is simply a continuation of Western ideas about colonization. Yes, the objects have become extremely valuable within the Western context of, of money. But the assumption that that's the only value they should have is a very problematic assumption. The indigenous societies had ways of thinking about how they use these objects, and those ways are not all there anymore, and societies have changed considerably. The king of Benin is a very significantly highly educated, London educated scholar, and he is invested in building a museum in Benin City. But he points out that one of the things he wants to do is to increase the object's involvement in cultural traffic within the city itself. They are still using objects in Benin City on an annual basis for rituals and ceremonies and co. But in the Western Museum, where these objects have been turned into objects of the sort that we're talking about, you cannot engage with the objects except as objects that you look at. So this is all part of what it would mean to deconstruct Western power over these objects, and to understand that just because they were framed that way doesn't mean it has to continue to be framed that way. I acknowledge the need for museums as institutions that preserve cultural memory, but the best type of way to preserve cultural memory is to keep it alive. Is to keep it alive. And once cultural memory is not alive, there's no amount of preservation that you can do that will stop it from basically dying. A lot of these objects in museums are dead objects. They should be. The societies that produce them should be afforded the chance to determine whether they need to be buried or used in any other way. So as not to go on too long, a quick example from contemporary art. Banksy sold a work recently, a couple of years ago, I think. The work was purchased at auction for $1 million, and as soon as the gavel rang and the work was handed over to the owner, something triggered inside the frame and the entire work shredded, right? So I'm pretty sure the owner is going to stitch it back together or put it in a vitrine case and say shredded Bansky, $1 million. So that is a function of capitalism. It's a function of the financialization of cultural production, of being itself. And we don't have to replicate that idea. If we if we look at different ways of using these objects, yeah, definitely to tell the indigenous communities what they can or cannot do with these objects is egregiously, arrogant in ways I can't even begin to explain.
Well, thank you very much. We have another question from Daniel Kuchin, our colleague from COMCOL. It's a question for Norman. Connecting to last Friday's session on repatriation and restitution, we talked about the exhausting repetition of extraction from communities. How can we as museum think about not extracting more, but think of circularity?
Yeah, reciprocity is an important dimension here. I think this connects in a very interesting way to the discussion that we just had around the values and the pressures around repatriation. I would add perhaps to this that the act of repatriating without acknowledging your obligations as an institution beyond that repatriation, that act is like the kind of the last act of extractive work that a museum can do with a community, because what the museum would be extracting is a kind of a symbolic capital gained through a repatriation, and that's it. So that I would say that how can museums think more about creating about moving beyond the extractive model? Well, there are scholars that write about how to have indigenous research that is non-extractive. Some of the tenets supporting that would be to promote forms of reciprocal research, to engage communities, to allow communities, encourage community members to define what their own needs and objectives are, and to not always steer the conversation. So to perhaps to Professor Obekji's point, museums, at least the museum that I have worked with, there are long lists of artifacts that can be repatriated anytime. The community is not ready for it, and they're not ready because the community has said that they're not ready for that. And so in some cases you have to follow what the community protocols are, and engaging and having those conversations and allowing the community to be in the driver's seat around the timelines, around objectives. And so not sure if that answers that, but to think beyond the extractive model, really it has to do with encouraging your communities to be interlocutors, to encourage them to set the agenda, and to not have the objectives always set by the museum.
Thank you, Norman. Sylvester, do you like to comment anything?
No.
No. We have another question from the public, addressing the interesting point of view of Professor Vorano. Do you have some suggestions of what components could integrate the concept of museum's identity, its museum's personas, in order to be considered apart from their own objects?
Yeah, I would argue that museums don't have identities separate from the collections they hold. I mean, that's the whole point, isn't it? The Museum of Modern Art in New York is the Museum of Modern Art because it owns and collected modern art, right? Part of what it's dealing with right now is how to actually remain relevant in a world where modern as a key signifier of cutting edge work is no longer, the currency contemporary is. So what they're doing with that is to propose and promote the idea of global modernism, which is the context in which they are working, to try and basically, co-opt and incorporate all the various resistance strands of modernism that had appeared in places where anti-colonial struggles were going on and things, and co-opt them into that larger history of modernism that's already defined by a Western canon as sort of secondary or species of that original canon. That's not the way to go, but that's what they are doing. I mean, I just checked the website a few minutes ago, and it's still the same old canonical listing. So yeah, you can't consider museums as personas, outside of the objects they collect. It is the very objects they collect that specify the nature of museums. Non-collecting institutions are able to move away from being stuck with this kind of association, but non-collecting institutions are essentially collecting and curating knowledge about cultural production. So that also sometimes, identifies them as working in very specific areas. So yeah, that's how I would look at this. I think instead of trying to imagine museums as independent things, understand through the history of museums that they have never really been independent of the kind of objects that exist within their collections.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I could add anything more to that. I would agree. And the only thing I would add is that I think I read a New York Times article not that long ago about the number of vacancies in museum directorship positions in the United States right now. Mm-hmm. And I think a part of it has to do with the fact that it's very, very difficult to distinguish the persona of that museum from the collections. And it's not an easy time to be a museum director right now, because of course museums are often the site of well-earned criticism for many different reasons for their histories. So.
Thank you both. I would like to ask another question related to this thing just Norman brought out. Do you think because of this context of museums kind of in a defensive position and kind of dealing with questioning from the society about their authority, dealing with the collections, do you think we can see or could be a problem to have some kind of canceling collections issue in a way that museums will start to avoid complicated mm-hmm. or collections, even not only working with complicated collections they already have, but refusing to acquire collections that could be complicated to interpret and to work with. So do you think this could be a problem, that some museums would start to simply hide the collections or avoid complicated collections?
Norman, do you want to start us off on this?
Well, I would just say that I know it's already happening. I know people that work particularly at smaller museums that they would just prefer to not deal with parts of their collection because they feel it's going to be expensive, it's going to be bad for them, it's going to be ugly, they're going to get a lot of bad press out of it, and they don't want that. And museums have been hit really hard with, recently particular with because of the pandemic. But I know that some institutions are already doing that, and I think it's too bad. But so yeah, I mean, I would just answer your question in the positive that I think it's already happening. But if I may, the good institutions understand, courageous leaders understand that we have to confront the histories of these institutions, and in these problems, where other people see problems, are actually really opportunities to build audience and build different communities around what you're doing, without always knowing what the output is going to be. And that's very challenging for a museum director, but there are some who are doing that. So
one must balance that also with the fact that most museum boards are extremely conservative.
Yeah.
And the risk to reward factor in being the as they used to call it, the dew breaker in the time of slavery. The dew breaker is the man who goes into the sugarcane fields to cut the first canes and knock the dew off the leaves before the mass of the other slaves go in. It's always a very risky thing to be, a risk taker, as it were. So one can understand how museum directors would be especially reticent. And yeah, everything Norman has said, that would be the ideal and practice of museums that are exceedingly timid or are small and just don't want to engage in this or that what seems to be quite large issues. So yeah, that's a problem. But the problem it raises is that that mindset is associated with an idea of preserving the museum the way it is. It's not associated with the idea of engaging these issues that we've been talking about here. If you want to preserve the museum the way it is, that's very easy. You just basically don't get involved in the discussion and continue to do, art dealers in Paris who deal in quote unquote primitive art. They don't care what anybody says about what they are doing as long as they find buyers. They are still marketing African art in exactly the same way they were marketing it in the 1930s and 40s as a product of anonymous artisans. From cultures that have no culture in essence, and this fattens their pockets. And what are you going to do about it? They basically are doing this as a dare to people. Say, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to come and shut down my shop? No, you're not going to do that. Christie's and Sotheby's are still selling stolen artworks despite massive protests against them doing that. So I pointed out in one talk I gave recently that I run into this as issues that kind of rear their head every once in a while and then get flattened back and subside under the weight of institutional and archival memory. These are not things that it took us 150 years or thereabouts to get here. We're not going to solve this problem in 5 days. The same thing with racism. It took us 400 years to get to contemporary, racism. We're not going to resolve racism in 5 years. So not being aware of that is a very big deal. If I may say one more thing, we stand at the cusp of something very, very extraordinary, which might completely change everybody's, attention on this matter. What this pandemic is showing us is that, the bringing of society to a halt as a result of, closures and lack of movement and everything creates an incentive to go digital in a very big way. It's hastening the digital future of humanities. And in that digital future, the engagement with cultural objects won't be by walking into a museum. It will be by going online and using VR and AR and other kinds of, virtual reality and digital techniques, which are getting much better by the day. So that's why I was making my argument about the importance of securing rights over these objects so that they don't emerge into the digital domain and we then come 15, 20 years later and start having this same discussion about, who should own the digital rights to the objects that museums are displaying. So it's not recognizing that we're right on that cusp that accounts for some of the kind of short-sighted, responses to the restitution issue that I've described much earlier. But that cusp is going to push us into a different world altogether. And within that new world, smaller museums that don't wish to engage issues of restitution and cultural patrimony will find a lot of chance to basically hide and not be visible just by showing a select amount of artworks from their collections and leaving the rest to kind of, disappear into obscurity, as it were.
The an additional dimension here, then I would just put this one level up very slightly from doing nothing, are when museums, the way they kind of deal with this is to call in a contemporary artist and invite them to do something kind of jazzy with their historical collections. And they come in, they do something, and everybody goes home happy, right? And then, next month is a new show. And I see this now a lot, where a gallery will invite in a contemporary artist to kind of go into the vault and do something that is, and there again too, I mean, these are not meaningful structural changes. I think that we have in mind.
I wrote a criticism of that exact process for Text Zukunft in 2015. Basically indicting contemporary artists who do that for colluding essentially with colonialism and its afterlives. Fred Wilson, inaugurated that practice. But again, this is one of the problems with the kind of work we do and contemporary life and art in general. Once is innovative, two is interesting, three is tedious. you know. And we find a repetition of, you know, since Fred Wilson, people have been doing that, and contemporary artists that go to do this thing, they claim that they're engaged in histories, but you notice that they never talk to the owners of the objects that they are reshuffling within the museum. So the museum again is retained as an established fact. It's the legitimacy of his collection is retained as an established fact, and then this process of, you know, tinkering with the collection in terms of mining the museum is seen as an advancement when it's really seriously regressive, you know. So that's a big problem. And I, again, as I said, I wrote an article about this a long time ago, and you know, it's a reality of the fact that you can write all these things and talk about all these things forever, and people simply do not look at it or listen to it or pay attention to it, you know. So that's that. One tiny addition, let me point out that I am aware and appreciate the fact that contemporary artists are trying to survive. They are trying to make their own mark, and, you know, opportunities to do this are not very common. When a museum invites you to come and do this kind of show, it's very difficult to refuse. That's the institutional power against which we're fighting, in essence. And so I'm not making a blanket indictment of contemporary artists for participating in this process. But the point I'd like to make is I've never seen anybody do this with Holocaust art. You know, no contemporary artist has ever been invited to go to Auschwitz or Dachau and you know, mine the terrain to make some kind of contemporary statement. You know, what is it they know that makes them avoid that kind of idea, but then, you know, agree to just, you know, shuffle around, you know, the collecting of non-Western art as if there were no problems attached. These are structures of power inequities seriously at play here.
Well, thank you very much. I don't see any other questions for the public. We still have some time. I'm sorry, but I would like to ask another question, if you agree.
Gabriel, you're moderating, so we can't stop you from asking.
But I'm talking too much. I'm sorry, but relating to this issue of the power and the structure of the practice of institutions in museums, I would like to share with you a perspective I have. I saw in the last 30 years maybe a big change in the way curators, in the whole of curators in museums. Now, we used to have curators as research specialists dedicated to collections, and now most museums have curators dedicated to put together shows, exhibition curators. Mm-hmm. So we have this change between a curator as a someone who takes care and know about the collection, and to someone now that work with exhibition projects. Mm-hmm. And this is happening, in my perspective, it is happening in every art museum all around the world. And this could be complicated, especially in this moment that we need to review and to study more our collections. So do you think this is a problem of the way we are talking about art history methodology and this kind of roles and professional roles? Do you think this is a problem that we should try to address, or this is just part of this new reality? Because in my perspective, some colleagues think I'm a little bit maybe too traditional, but I think this is part of the problem that you already mentioned about collections being very complex and very expensive to deal with. And with this decolonization pressure, we can have more of this, and with these institutions avoiding this kind of issue. So if you could share with us some views regarding it, it would be very great. Thank you.
Norman, can you start us off on this, please?
Try to. I can really only speak from my own experiences, having been a curator. I'm struck repeatedly by the paradox today, where you know, you see the word curate around everywhere. You know, you're having your lunch is being curated by the restaurant and all of this kind of stuff. But the paradox is that we see this kind of the very promiscuous use of this word curate today, curator. However, the responsibilities of an actual curator in a museum, they seem to be narrowing. And because now in big institutions, the locus of generating exhibition ideas, I mean, that now is shared amongst, you know, everyone from the education department to the fundraisers to the interpretive planners and everyone under the sun. And so the what an actual curator does in a museum seems to be shrinking now. However, one of the things that I think was essential to the role of a curator, beyond the kind of the repository of knowledge that I think we've kind of been critical of today, is that a curator actually manages relationships. That's ultimately what they do. And their knowledge of the collection is only useful insofar as it allows them to manage relationships with whether they're, you know, relationships with visiting researchers or community members that want to come in to see their own ancestral collections, whether it's the trying to integrate the appropriate kinds of pieces into an exhibition that's developed somewhere else. And so I think the kind of the way in which our thinking around this question of what the curator does and their role within a museum, the way that's getting short-circuited now is that people are kind of thinking that a curator is or was a content producer of some sort, when in fact the core of their responsibility was to manage relationships. So I don't know if that answers what you're asking, Gabrielle, about this.
Yes, Rama, it was really good to have your view on this. Sylvester, do you like to comment on something?
No, I think Norman just, you know, covered the whole thing. I should point out that within the German context of museum, and in terms of museum history, within the German context of, you know, engagements with ethnographic museums and co, the role of the of the curator was actually to be a scientist of sorts, which meant that knowledge production was their primary objective. And that knowledge was produced from the management of objects, obviously, and expertise in that management was required and co. But the curator was defined in the German context as a researcher, you know, working within the museum in relation to objects in the museum's collection. So the exhibition and things were all aspects of this process, but exhibitions gradually became the things that curators did. And to do the exhibition, of course, they do a lot of research on the objects that are going into the exhibitions and co. So yeah, it's Norman has a very good point about the narrowing of the idea of curatorial work within the museum, simultaneous with this expansiveness, you know, in culture in general. But things like this happen all the time. So.
Oh, guys, thank you very much. It was, I don't know if you have any other questions. We are about to finish our time. So I would like to thank you very much for being here. It was amazing, your brilliant contributions to the topic. Thank you so much. And I also like to thank Keina Layson from the Museum of Modern Arts in Rio. She's our critical listener, and we'll have her ideas soon about this whole discussion. So it will be great. So thank you very much. Thank you to all the production and the people who helped to do this amazing debate, and of course all the participants who sent the questions. Thank you so much.
I would like to see a copy of Kena's, you know, critical listening report. that would
You
provide
will.
very good feedback. So
Wait and see.
Yeah.
okay.
So
I want to also thank the organizers for the event and thank my fellow speaker Norman. It's always nice to listen to, you know, people when we're grappling with these serious issues. It does show, you know, that we're not lacking goodwill. What we're lacking is, you know, just a way to get a handle on what is otherwise a really extraordinarily complex problems. So please accept my sincerest greetings and thanks to everybody who attended.